Natalie Hayes slammed her bag onto the bar, exhaling sharply. "I need something strong," she muttered, rubbing her temples. This night had been a disaster. Her best friend, Olivia, had dragged her to this high-end gala at the Sterling Hotel, promising networking opportunities. Instead, Natalie had spent the past 2 hours dodging arrogant men in tailored suits who thought, "What do you do?" was just another way of asking if she was single. She glanced around the dimly lit bar, taking in the sea of designer gowns and tuxedos. She didn't belong here. Her dress, borrowed from Olivia, was a little too tight, her heels were killing her, and worst of all, she had spilled wine down the front of her skirt within 10 minutes of arriving. A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "Rough night." She looked up to see the bartender. He was tall, with dark brown hair, piercing blue eyes, and a sharp jawline that could cut glass. He was ridiculously good-looking, which felt unfair. Did bartenders at luxury hotels have to look like models now? "You have no idea," she sighed. "Just give me something strong, surprise me." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bar. "You sure about that? You look like a whiskey kind of woman." She raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does a whiskey woman look like?" He gave her a slow, knowing grin, sharp, unapologetic, a little stubborn. She narrowed her eyes. "That sounds suspiciously like an insult." "Not at all," he said, grabbing a bottle and pouring her a drink. "It's a compliment. Whiskey women don't waste time pretending to be someone they are not." Natalie took the glass and sipped. It burned in the best way. "Not bad," she admitted. The bartender, who still hadn't given his name, watched her with an amused expression. "So, what brings you to a place like this?" "Bad decisions," she muttered. "My friend insisted I needed to network, but so far, I've just gotten hit on by men who think their bank accounts make them interesting." He chuckled. "Sounds about right for this crowd." She studied him, intrigued. "You don't seem too fond of them either. You must hear a lot of stories from behind this bar." "You could say that." He wiped down the counter with practiced ease. "But I prefer listening to people who don't put on a show." "Like me," she teased. "Exactly." Natalie found herself smiling. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time tonight, she didn't feel like she had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. "Do you have a name, or should I just call you Whiskey Whisperer?" she asked. He chuckled. "Brandon's." "Nice to meet you, Brandon. I'm Natalie." They talked for a while, and she found herself enjoying his company more than she expected. He was sharp-witted, confident, but not in the arrogant way most of the men here were. "You know," she said, twirling her glass, "you're way too charming to be a bartender." Brandon's expression didn't change, but his blue eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. "Is that so?" "Yeah," she mused, "you carry yourself differently. You're, I don't know, confident in a way that makes me think you don't actually need to be here." He leaned in slightly. "And what if I told you that sometimes people just like doing things they don't need to do?" She tilted her head. "That sounds suspiciously like rich guy logic." He laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe." Before she could press further, Olivia appeared, slightly breathless. "Nat, we have to go now." Natalie frowned. "Why, what's wrong?" Olivia grabbed her wrist. "I'll explain later, but seriously, let's go." Natalie turned back to Brandon. "I guess this is goodbye." "Guess so," he said, but something in his expression told her he wasn't done with her just yet. As she followed Olivia out of the gala, she had no idea she had just walked away from the most powerful man in the room. Natalie barely had time to process her abrupt departure from the gala before Olivia dragged her out into the night air. The city lights stretched high above them, shimmering against the sleek cars lining the entrance of the Sterling Hotel. "Are you going to tell me what that was about?" Natalie asked, breathless. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, scanning the crowd as if expecting someone to follow. "You wouldn't believe me if it told you." Try me." Her friend exhaled sharply. "I may have accidentally insulted the CEO of Sterling Enterprises." Natalie blinked. "You what?" Olivia groaned. "I didn't know who he was." I was talking to a group about how these billionaire types always think they own the world, and then someone casually mentioned that Brandon Sterling was standing right behind me. Natalie stilled, the name hitting her like a slow-moving realization. Brandon's. Her mind flickered back to the bartender with piercing blue eyes and an effortless confidence that had felt just a little too natural. No, it couldn't be. Wait, she said carefully, what does he look like? Olivia frowned, tall, dark hair, ridiculously handsome, and the way he carries himself, you just know he's powerful. A strange sensation curled in Natalie's stomach. And you're sure his name is Brandon Sterling? Positive, Olivia groaned. He owns half the city, Nat. If he wanted to, he could probably make sure I never work in marketing again. Natalie's thoughts spun. Had she seriously spent the last hour talking to a billionaire mistaking him for a bartender, and worse, had he let her? Her pulse quickened as she replayed the night. The way he had spoken, the way he deflected her questions about whether he belonged there, it all made sense now. He had been toying with her. The next morning, Natalie arrived at the small cafe near her apartment, still processing the revelation. She had barely slept, her mind tangled in frustration and embarrassment. Why hadn't he corrected her? Why had he let her believe he was just a bartender? She ordered her coffee and sat by the window, scrolling through her phone aimlessly. And then, as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, a familiar voice broke through the quiet hum of the cafe. Surprised to see me. She looked up. Brandon stood across from her table, looking just as composed as he had last night, except now he wasn't hiding behind a bar. He wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that probably cost more than her rent, and despite the early hour, he looked effortlessly put together. Natalie set down her coffee. What are you doing here? His lips quirked slightly. I figured you might have some questions. Questions? She folded her arms. Oh, you mean like why the CEO of Sterling Enterprises was pretending to be a bartender? Brandon pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down like he had all the time in the world. I wasn't pretending. I own the hotel. I like to keep an eye on things from time to time. By making drinks. By seeing how people act when they don't know who I am. His gaze held her steadily. You'd be surprised how many people change when they realize they're talking to someone with money. Natalie frowned, so last night was just some kind of test. He shook his head, no, it wasn't. She wanted to argue, but the sincerity in his voice gave her pause. Still, that didn't erase the fact that he had let her make a fool of herself. You could have told me, she pointed out. Would you have treated me the same way if I had? She opened her mouth to respond, but the truth stopped her. No, she wouldn't have. She would have been polite, professional, guarded, because men like Brandon Sterling lived in a different world than she did. That's what I thought, he said, reading her silence. She exhaled sharply. So what now? Did you come here to make sure I don't go around telling people I mistook you for a bartender? Brandon leaned forward slightly, the air between them shifting. No, Natalie, came here because I enjoyed talking to you. Her heart did something traitorous in her chest. I don't play games, she warned. Neither do I, he said, his voice steady. But I do know when I've met someone I don't want to walk away from. She should have been more guarded, should have reminded herself that men like him didn't just show up at coffee shops for women like her. But when he looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room, she found herself dangerously close to believing him. Natalie wasn't sure why she agreed to dinner with Brandon, but somehow, she found herself seated in the back of a sleek, chauffeur-driven car, her nerves twisting in ways she didn't fully understand. She had tried to tell herself this wasn't a date. It was just a conversation, a way to satisfy her curiosity about the man who had so effortlessly stepped into her world and turned it upside down. But as she glanced at Brandon, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his fingers resting casually against his knee, she knew she was lying to herself. They arrived at a restaurant that didn't have a name on the door, yet the valet greeted Brandon with familiarity. Inside, the lighting was low, the air thick with the scent of something decadent. The maitre d' led them to a private table near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city skyline. Do you always pull out all the stops? Natalie asked, settling into her seat. Brandon handed the wine list back without looking at it. Only when I want to impress someone. Her pulse skipped. She wasn't sure if she liked how easily he affected her. The waiter poured their wine, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, comfortable, charged. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Brandon finally said. She didn't have to ask what he meant. He knew she was still trying to figure him out. It's not every day I meet someone who enjoys misleading people about who they really are. His expression didn't waver. "If I had introduced myself as Brandon Sterling, CEO, would you have spoken to me the same way?" She sighed, "Probably not." "And that's exactly why I don't always lead with it." He leaned back. "People treat you differently when they think you have power." She studied him, trying to reconcile the man who had poured her whiskey with the one who now sat across from her in a restaurant she never could have afforded on her own. "So what are you expecting from me?" His gaze locked onto hers. "Nothing, that's what makes this interesting." Her stomach fluttered at the intensity in his voice. She hated that he had this effect on her. The conversation shifted, becoming unexpectedly easy. He asked about her work, her passions, the things she wanted out of life. And the more they talked, the more Natalie realized that Brandon wasn't just some untouchable billionaire. He was sharp, thoughtful, and had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the room. At some point, the plates disappeared, the wine was refilled, and she lost track of time. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "Neither are you," he said, watching her carefully. "Most people would have run the moment they found out who I was." She arched a brow. "Do I look like someone who runs?" His lips curved slightly. "No, you don't." A subtle tension hummed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. By the time they left, the city had settled into a quiet hum, the streets bathed in the glow of streetlights. Brandon walked her to the car, his presence steady beside her. As the driver opened the door, she hesitated. She should say goodnight, thank him, and walk away, but instead she turned to face him. "Why me?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because you're not afraid to challenge me." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, before she could overthink it, she stepped into the car. As the door closed behind her and the city blurred past, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't just curious about Brandon Sterling anymore. She was in trouble. Natalie wasn't sure when exactly she had stopped thinking about Brandon Sterling as the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the city and started seeing him as the man who made her laugh over late-night phone calls, who had an uncanny ability to remember the smallest details about her, who looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. But somewhere between that first dinner and now, standing at the edge of his penthouse balcony, she realized she was in far deeper than she had ever intended to be. The city stretched out below them, lights twinkling like fallen stars, but she barely noticed. Brandon stood beside her, his presence commanding yet oddly comforting. The evening air carried the scent of something crisp and expensive, mingling with the faintest trace of cologne that had become familiar to her. "I had a feeling you'd like it up here," Brandon said, watching her reaction. She turned to him, tilting her head slightly. "You have a habit of assuming things about me." His mouth curved in a slow, deliberate way, "And so far I haven't been wrong." She wanted to argue, but he had a point. Every time he made an assumption about her, what she liked, what made her tick, what she would or wouldn't do, he was eerily accurate. It was both unnerving and intoxicating to be known so well by someone she hadn't even planned on letting in. "You're quiet," he observed after a moment. "Just thinking," she admitted. "What about?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "How this all happened." He didn't break eye contact. "You mean how a woman who wanted nothing to do with men like me ended up on my balcony?" She exhaled a soft laugh, "Something like that." Brandon took a step closer, his voice quieter now. "Would you take it back if you could?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. She should have said yes. It would have been the logical answer. But logic had stopped applying the moment he had walked into her life. No, she admitted, I wouldn't. Something flickered in his expression, something raw and unguarded. Good, he murmured, because I wouldn't either. The words settled into her, warm and undeniable. She wasn't naive. She knew that people like Brandon, men who wielded power like it was second nature, didn't let people in easily. But somehow, she had gotten past the carefully controlled exterior, past the polished charm, and found the man underneath. And now, standing here with the city at their feet and the weight of something unspoken pressing between them, she realized there was no turning back. Brandon reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers effortlessly. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was real. She squeezed his hand in response, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Natalie hadn't expected to fall for Brandon Sterling. She hadn't expected any of this. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of late-night conversations, stolen moments in places she never imagined stepping foot in, and an undeniable pull toward a man who, against all odds, had become someone she couldn't stop thinking about. Yet despite the undeniable connection between them, something gnawed at her. She was standing in his world, but was there truly a place for her in it? The thought lingered as she navigated her way through the towering glass doors of the Sterling Enterprises headquarters. Brandon had asked her to meet him here, something about an important evening. But as she stepped into the sleek marble lobby, she felt the weight of curious glances from employees who undoubtedly recognized who she was with. The receptionist greeted her with polite efficiency before directing her toward the private elevator. As she stepped inside, she exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The doors slid open to reveal a breathtaking office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline. Brandon stood by his desk, his phone in hand, but the moment he saw her, his expression shifted into something softer, something only she ever seemed to see. He crossed the room without hesitation, his presence magnetic. "You made it," he said, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like relief. Natalie set her bag down on the polished desk. "You're being cryptic today, what's going on?" Brandon hesitated for the briefest moment before reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small, elegant folder. He placed it in front of her without a word. Curious, she flipped it open. Her breath caught at the sight of her name printed at the top of the document. "A job offer." She looked up at him, searching his expression. "What is this?" "A position at Sterling Enterprises, something that aligns with your skills, something that would let you step into this world on your own terms," he said. Her heart pounded. "You don't have to do this," she said carefully, trying to gauge his intentions. "I know," he replied, his gaze steady, "but I want to." The weight of his words settled over her. This wasn't about power, about control. This was about him giving her the choice to decide where she fit. Still, doubt lingered. "Would I be working for you?" Brandon shook his head. "Different department, no special treatment, just an opportunity if you want it." Natalie traced the edge of the folder, the offer tempting in more ways than one. She had spent years working hard, proving herself this wasn't a handout, it was a door opening. But was she ready to step through it? She met his gaze once more, "And if I say no?" His lips pressed together, but there was no disappointment in his expression, only understanding. "Then nothing changes between us." Her chest tightened. He had meant it when he said he wasn't trying to control her. After a long moment, she closed the folder. "I need time to think." Brandon nodded. "Take all the time you need." The ease with which he said it, the complete lack of pressure, made her decision even harder. Because for the first time in a long time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had finally met someone who truly saw her. And that terrified her more than anything else. Natalie sat in her apartment, staring at the elegant folder on her coffee table. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, thoughts colliding in her mind like waves crashing against the shore. Brandon had given her something she never expected, a choice. He hadn't pressured her, hadn't tried to manipulate her decision, he had simply offered an opportunity and left the rest up to her. And yet, that made it even harder. Was she ready to step into his world in a way that wasn't just personal but professional? Could she work in an empire built by the man who had somehow turned her life upside down without losing herself in the process? Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. Olivia's name flashed across it. "Are you still overthinking this?" Olivia's voice was light, but there was an edge of knowing in it. "You know me too well," Natalie muttered. "Of course I do," Olivia said. "And I also know you wouldn't even be considering this if you didn't already know what you wanted to do." Natalie ran a hand through her hair, exhaling, "It's just a lot." "Everything with him has been a lot since day one," Olivia pointed out. "But has any of it felt wrong?" The question made her pause. Despite the whirlwind nature of their relationship, despite the way Brandon had entered her life unexpectedly, not once had she felt like she was being pulled into something she didn't want. "No," she admitted, "it hasn't." "Then maybe that's your answer." Natalie let the words sink in long after they ended the call. The next morning she walked into Sterling Enterprises, the folder tucked under her arm, her heart steady with the weight of her decision. Brandon was in his office when she entered, standing by the window, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He turned when he heard her, his eyes searching hers for an answer before she even spoke. She placed the folder on his desk. "I'm taking it." A slow, deliberate expression crossed his face, not surprise, not triumph, just something deep and unreadable. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. He didn't say anything right away, just studied her like she was the most fascinating thing in the room. Then, with a single nod, he accepted her decision. She had expected some grand moment, but instead, there was just a quiet understanding between them. She had chosen this not because of him, not because of expectations, but because she wanted to. Days turned into weeks, and Natalie found herself settling into her new role with a surprising ease. The work was challenging, the pace relentless, but she thrived in it, and despite her fears, she hadn't lost herself. Brandon had been true to his word. There was no favoritism, no special treatment. He remained the powerful, calculating man in the boardroom, but when they were alone, when the world fell away, he was simply Brandon. And she was his. One evening, as they walked along the quiet streets after a long day, he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers effortlessly. "You never stop surprising me," he murmured. She glanced at him, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Good, I'd hate to be predictable." His grip tightened slightly. "You never could be." The intensity in his voice sent something warm curling through her chest. They stopped in front of her building, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Natalie," he said, her name a quiet promise on his lips. She swallowed, sensing something shifting in the air between them. "I never expected you," he admitted, "but now I can't imagine a world without you in it." Her breath hitched, her heart pounding. Then, before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her stomach dropped, her pulse racing. Brandon opened it, revealing a ring that caught the city lights in a dazzling display. "I don't want just a moment or a few years," he said. "I want forever with you." Tears prickled at her eyes, an overwhelming rush of emotions overtaking her. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice unsteady. His gaze never wavered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." A laugh bubbled from her lips, half disbelief, half pure joy. "Then yes." The word had barely left her mouth before he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a depth that left her breathless. The city buzzed around them, but in that moment, nothing else existed. Months later, as she stood in a breathtaking gown, surrounded by the people who mattered most, she locked eyes with the man who had changed everything. Brandon reached for her hand, his grip steady, his love unwavering. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear. She smiled, her heart full. Always. And as they exchanged vows, sealing their future together, she knew she had found exactly where she was meant to be.